Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today focuses on something quite fascinating happening in media right now, the really rapid globalization of boys' love, or BL. It started, as many know, mainly in Japanese manga, then really took off and changed through live-action shows across Asia, Thailand, Korea, Taiwan especially. It's gone from something quite niche to, well, a pretty major global cultural thing.
Exactly. And that brings us to the core tension, the question we're digging into. When Western studios start using, the specific feel, the emotional style, the pacing, the look pioneered in Asian BL, like we see in shows such as Heartstopper or maybe Red, White, and Royal Blue, is this just, let's say, authentic growth? Is it creating a kind of global language for queer visibility? Or is it maybe a bit more complex than that?
And that's the split. I'll be arguing that this artistic evolution is, well, natural. It's progressive, even healthy for the art form. It's like any other artistic cross-pollination we've seen throughout history, essentially turning BL into a kind of universal language.
And I'm going to argue that actually, quite often, this Western adoption tends to flatten the material. It removes the really crucial social context that was often high stakes, which gave Asian BL so much of its depth. And crucially, it often fails to properly acknowledge its specific cultural roots. So is it maybe cultural appropriation kind of disguised as representation? That's my position.
Okay, I understand framing it as erasure, but let me offer a slightly different angle, one rooted in how global culture tends to work. I mean, look, every major art form that achieves that kind of massive global reach, it changes, it evolves. BL is no different, right? It moved from Japanese manga and drama into this cultural language of queer visibility that genuinely speaks across borders. And for a long time, let's be honest, Asian BL gave us something Western media really lacked, these honest, empathetic stories about male-male intimacy, but told without falling back on, harmful stereotypes or the almost obligatory tragic endings. So when Western adaptations pop up, I see them as simply continuing this powerful emotional legacy. They're bringing the core message to new global audiences, people who might never have stumbled upon the original Thai or Korean or Japanese forms. Because the essence of BL, for me, is that emotional vulnerability, that connection.
And that essence surely transcends nationality. We've seen this dynamic play out before. Think about K-pop. It redefined global music using very specific aesthetic and production styles, and it spread globally without, fundamentally, losing its Korean identity. Spread is the growth. So Western creators adapting a successful format, that's not stealing, it's adaptation. And every single time a viewer somewhere new feels seen because of that emotional connection, well, that's real progress.
That's an interesting parallel with K-pop, but I might frame that comparison a bit differently. I'd focus more on responsibility, perhaps, rather than just visibility. Because honestly, I just don't quite buy the premise that taking a powerful, very distinct form and then deliberately kind of downplaying where it came from is homage. I think it constitutes erasure, precisely because it ignores the struggle that's often embedded right in the material. BL was born in very specific, often quite restrictive cultural and emotional context. I mean, in Japan, it really emerged as a kind of resistance through fiction, didn't it? A creative space mainly for women and queer fans to explore desire relatively safely. And crucially, in more contemporary markets like Thailand or Korea, it became this coded way, a necessary coded way, to talk about queer desire within systems where being overtly public about it was difficult, sometimes even dangerous. Leading to subtle government pressures or forms of soft censorship. That complexity, that inherent risk, that's what gave the genre its soul, I think. So when Western adaptations take the aesthetic, you mentioned it, the soft lighting, the intense gazes, the slow emotional burn, but they strip away that crucial social weight behind it all, they flatten it. They make it into something merely marketable, something safe. And maybe the strongest evidence for this viewpoint is that often Western creators actively avoid calling their work BL. It suggests they want the prestige, maybe the feeling of originality, without the responsibility of acknowledging the complex, sometimes foreign, source material. It feels a bit like standing on a foundation someone else built, but claiming you laid the first stone.
But, okay, if the genre doesn't evolve, if it doesn't reshape itself for new places, new audiences, does it just stop growing? I mean, if we try to lock down the definition of BL only to its original socio-political context, this idea of coded resistance, aren't we risking kind of suffocating its expressive potential? Surely the goal should be diversity within BL, diversity of setting, social challenges, race, everything, not trying to claim ownership over it. It sounds a bit like you're arguing for a kind of cultural gatekeeping, which could actually prevent what might be the most potent cultural export of queer Asian storytelling from reaching the widest possible audience.
I suppose I come at it from a different angle. For me, the issue isn't evolution itself. Evolution is natural, of course. It's about the nature of the acknowledgement or lack thereof. I think true globalization, especially when the borrowing happens between, let's say, a dominant cultural market and one that's been historically marginalized in different ways, requires gratitude. It requires transparency. Let's try and ground this in the material, right? When you look at a classic Thai BL, something like Bad Buddy, or maybe even Together, which was huge, the struggle isn't just internal romance drama. It's often about navigating really restrictive family expectations or school hierarchies, or just a general lack of public acceptance. And the aesthetic, that subtle touch, the longing gaze, we talked about it, functions as a necessary code, a way to bypass those external constraints. Now compare that aesthetic deployed in something like, say, Red, White, and Royal Blue. The setting is, the White House, a massive seat of institutional power. The main characters are already pretty culturally privileged. So when they use that slow burn structure, it feels more like a purely dramatic device. The crucial socio-political weight, the necessity of the code that existed in the Thai context, it's largely gone. The form of tenderness you're celebrating was often achieved through real creative struggle in Asian markets. So when Western creators take that signature visual style and sort of present it as if they just invented it, they are, perhaps unintentionally, forgetting the cultural risk, the history that built the genre's foundation.
But art has always borrowed. Often across vastly different power dynamics, we can point to precedents all through history. Shakespeare borrowed freely from ancient myths, from historical chronicles. That was adaptation, surely not appropriation, that built his legacy. And we also have to remember even Thai BL itself borrowed and adapted visual language, particularly from Japanese yaoi manga, and then successfully made it something uniquely their own. Every generation, every region kind of reshapes the form for its own audience. So this current Western activity, I see it as simply adaptation. It's a continuous reshaping of the form for local audiences who are connecting with that emotional core. If the emotional truth survives the journey, what real difference does the source language make to the viewer, somewhere else in the world who finally feels seen by that story?
This idea that we somehow have to halt this cross-pollination because of a perceived historical debt, that strikes me as fundamentally anti-artistic, actually.
That's a compelling point about historical precedent, Shakespeare and all that. But I think that comparison maybe misses a crucial difference between, say, internal regional borrowing within Asia and this global cross-cultural adoption by dominant Western markets. The difference for me lies in transparency and, importantly, the historical baggage of the terminology itself. You mentioned the Japanese origin. And just for clarity, we should probably remember yaoi was the original term, developed primarily by women fans, often focusing more on explicit content. Boys love, or BL, is a more modern umbrella term, heavily shaped by the live-action dramas we're mostly talking about today, which often prioritize emotional intimacy, sometimes over explicit sex. Now, when Thai BL adapted Japanese tropes, they engaged directly with the genre's own language. BL or yaoi were terms in circulation. Western studios, however, often seem to actively avoid the specific, maybe foreign-sounding term BL. They tend to label their work simply as, YA romance or queer drama. And this arguably implies that their version, often the safer Western product, frequently featuring already privileged protagonists, is somehow the normative, or even the original form of queer romance. It deliberately divorces it from the specific, non-Western, often non-English cultural labor that actually defined the aesthetic in the first place. That lack of specific sourcing, that avoidance of the term, that's where I think the respect gets lost, and that original context of resistance through fiction risks being forgotten.
Okay, but let me clarify my objection further then, because I absolutely champion Western creators making queer love stories. That's not the issue. My issue is against the act of taking the specific tools, the specific aesthetics of a genre, without giving credit. I think that violates a pretty fundamental principle, that empathy across boundaries requires recognizing who built the stage first. We should celebrate the stories, yes, but also honor the cultural labor that made the template possible in the first place.
Okay, I hear that. But for me, the key question becomes practical. What mechanism exactly are you demanding for this gratitude? I mean, if we demand specific written credit for every single aesthetic choice, like a little note saying, slow burn derived from Thai Beal tradition, where does that line actually end? Does that risk becoming, as I said, cultural gatekeeping? While I absolutely respect the need for acknowledgement, putting up walls around this aesthetic, I worry it just slows down the spread of the overall message, the message of queer acceptance globally.
Look at the success of Heartstopper. It isn't just that it's a charming story, it's also in its ability to take that soft, tender, non-tragic emotional language, which was arguably perfected in Asian BL, and deliver it effectively to a massive, new, global demographic. For me, the ultimate progress is achieved through that visibility, that accessibility of the emotional legacy. The message is expanded beyond its original boundaries, and that feels like a cultural victory that justifies the journey, and yes, perhaps the change in form along the way.
Well, the mechanism is actually quite simple. I think it's about recognition. Recognition within public discourse, within promotion, by creators and critics. It's not about demanding footnotes in the script itself. It's about creators and critics not acting as if the template for depicting male-male affection with such unwavering optimism just sprang fully formed from Western media in the last few years. We actually see this happening with K-pop now. Western media routinely acknowledges the specific production standards, the formats, the training systems that define K-pop. That level of acknowledgement, that's the kind of gratitude I'm talking about. Without that, you risk the dominant culture benefiting from the innovation while essentially culturally erasing the innovators. The struggle, the context that forged the template gets forgotten, leaving behind only a kind of sanitized, easily marketable shell.
I'm still not entirely convinced that focusing so heavily on the, let's say, purity of the source material is ultimately as beneficial as maximizing the emotional impact globally. While I do acknowledge the risks you're highlighting, the risks of cultural erasure, I still believe the expansive power of this particular aesthetic, its ability to connect, outweighs the concern over essentially proper citation in every instance. The emotional connection these stories foster, the simple, powerful act of showing loving, non-tragic male relationships on screen, for me, that justifies their adaptation and their global reach. The message, the core message of intimate, empathetic connection, has successfully escaped the boundaries of its origin. And that, at the end of the day, is an undeniable form of growth.
And I'd agree that stories absolutely must travel and transform. But I maintain that growth is only truly, let's say, beautiful or ethical if it's rooted in that gratitude, in rigorous acknowledgement. So yes, while we must celebrate the expansion of queer narratives everywhere, the challenge, I believe, remains ensuring that the specific cultural and social truth inherent in the Asian origins of BL, the courage it often took, the coded resistance, the complexity, is remembered, is celebrated, and isn't conveniently erased just for mass marketability.
It seems the material itself suggests that BL's globalization might in fact contain elements of both sides of this argument. It clearly is undeniable growth, a huge expansion. But that growth perhaps often occurs via a subtle, sometimes maybe even unconscious process of appropriation.
Yeah, it's a profound reminder, isn't it, that stories often do lose vital parts of themselves when they travel, which really emphasizes how important it is to consider these multiple perspectives on artistic transformation and to try and ensure that the source of that emotional truth isn't forgotten, even as the genre expands its reach across the world.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. See you in the next one.